Well, good morning, everybody. It's a beautiful day outside. We're grateful for that and glad to see you in this class. We welcome those who are streaming the class. Almost every week I hear from somebody who says, I watch you on Sunday morning, or I see you sometimes Sunday. We're getting a little feedback up there, down here or something. But I'm glad to know that the streaming is available and that a number of people are taking advantage of that. It continues to be a joy for me to work with Jim Brown and teaching this class, and I appreciate the work he does and the encouragement that he is for me. Let's begin this morning with prayer. Father, there are lots of things going on involving our church life. And we think about the things that have occurred in the past few days and the things that lie just ahead. We're grateful for the return of our mission group to Mexico, for the safety of their travel, for the effectiveness of their work, and for the things that they learned. We think of the Carla Perry family yesterday in that funeral service and pray that you would bless them in the days that lie ahead. We think of the fact that camp comes up just 1 week later, and as people prepare to go off to camp and teachers prepare their work, we ask your blessings on them and the effectiveness of that series of activities for a full week. It's a meaningful time for our young people. It's a meaningful time for our church folks who work so hard in making ready for that camp. And we think of other activities that are designed for the summer. We're grateful for the work that James and Nathan do in keeping our young people involved over the summer months when school is not in session. I'm grateful that they stay busy and they stay connected with church activities. And now we're grateful for our class this morning as we continue our study of the lives of David and Solomon, a crucial part of the Old Testament. And we are engaged in that study and look forward to its continuation. We ask your blessings on each member of this class. In Christ's name, amen. The Russian novel Anna Karenina, anyway, you know what I'm talking about. I have trouble saying Karenina. Begins with a sentence that says, happy families are all alike. Well, I hope that's true in terms of happy families, but sometimes that thing is said almost sarcastically. Yeah, they're all alike. They can't get along. The families of David and Solomon are a primary study of the difficulties involved in some family structures. We're going to focus on those families over the next several days. Last week we began it with the title of a lesson that said, Two Sons. And we looked at two sons born to David and to Bathsheba. One, a child born out of wedlock or conceived out of wedlock. And then that second son was Solomon. That doesn't fit them into the chronology of David's children. Just take them as an exception. Two sons. And today we're going to talk about two brothers. As we continue looking at the structure of David's family, the internal conflicts that exist in that family. I was thinking this last week as I was anticipating this lesson, because of my study of Greek tragedies, you can almost imagine the study of David's family is anticipation of Greek tragedy, because so many of them are family-oriented. What happens when one member of the family gets at odds with another member of the family and chaos reigns? That sounds pretty ancient, and it even sounds almost dignified because we think of great literature. But the story of David and his family is also as contemporary as today's soap operas. We don't have to get sophisticated or intellectual about it. Truthfully, it's just families go awry. And you wonder why and how all of that happens. And so we begin today with a conflict between two members of this family, not actual brothers, half-brothers. With all of David's associations with a variety of women, his children deal in kind of fractured arrangements. They're not all truly brother and sister. In the case of Amnon and Tamar, they are literal brother and sister. They have the same mother, they have the same father, and we're going to deal with that in just a moment. This story comes from 2 Samuel chapter 13, and if you read the entire chapter, you get that entire story. The portion of our text that we pick up with for today begins after the problem arose over the rape of Tamar. But you can't ignore that. That's a very important ingredient in this story. And so we look at this family arrangement. When you think of all that David experienced with the birth of that infant and that death, as Jim led us in that study last week, and then God's decision to give them something positive out of all of that negativism, Solomon is born. These are not arranged in chronological order, and that child born to Bathsheba was not David's first son, and Solomon was not his second son. Actually, his first son is Amnon, the one we'll talk about today. And because he is regarded as the first son, he is the heir apparent. He grows up in the house assuming, one of these days, I'll sit where my father sits. I'll be king. We've just gone through an interesting historical perspective on waiting for the throne and assuming the throne. We've all watched over the last several decades as Prince Charles wondered if he'd ever get to be king. Some folks said his mother's determined she'll outlive him, and she almost did. But we watch all the maneuverings, the planning, the arranging, the hoping. Finally, my turn will come, and I become monarch. Well, that's the kind of thing that Amnon dealt with. And later sons of David had the same ambition. What if I could sit on my father's throne? It sometimes beggars the idea that they had any respect for their fathers. They just wanted his job. But then we start learning a story like this one today. I'm not sure how much respect David had for his sons. Because we're told in one text, after the sin of Amnon, that David never said anything to him, good or bad. It was as if he just ignored the boy. If he did something well, there was no commendation. If he did something terrible, there was no condemnation. To rape his half-sister should have been an act for condemnation. But David says nothing, neither good nor bad. So what happens in our text for today? We begin finding out that Amnon has an unhealthy and unreasonable lust for Tamar. In a family primarily dominated by men, to have a woman born in that family, Tamar, must have been a matter of pride for David and his wife, their daughter. But Amnon began to be attracted to her, an attraction that grew to lust. And lust, ill-conceived, never has a good result. He lusted after her to such an extent that the Bible even talks about the fact he became sick. He was overwhelmed with his lust. What could he do to get her? And then there was his cousin, Jonadab, who came along. There's always a Jonadab somewhere off on the side who's filled with good advice. From his perspective, it's not always sound, but what he thinks is good advice, and he's perfectly willing to share it. Don't you like those people who always know what you ought to be doing and are happy to tell you about it? Jonadab says, oh, I can tell you how to do this. And so he proposes that Amnon become really sick unto death, take to his bed. Sick enough that David finally comes to check on him. And Amnon's request is, I think I would feel better if Tamar would fix my supper and bring it to the room and serve me. You and I would like to think that sounds harmless enough, but we know the rest of the story. It's not harmless enough. And so David makes that agreement. He should have thought through this. But he agrees to let Tamar come to his house, to Amnon's house, prepare him a meal. I couldn't help wondering if one of the reasons for making that request was Tamar known as somebody with excellent culinary skills, Was she known for her ability to cook, to prepare meals? I don't think Amnon would want her if she didn't know how to handle herself in the kitchen. What if she messed up everything she tried to cook? That wouldn't be attractive. But she comes. She brings the food she's prepared. And Amnon, playing the invalid, says to her, just take that, bring that to my bedroom. Now, all of us know the danger of a woman being in a man's bedroom. That's just not a wise move. Shirley and I always get amazed as we watch various shows on television or newscasts when some woman says, well, he asked me to come to his room, and why? Why be that stupid? You can even quote scripture, avoid the appearance of evil. But Tamar goes. And then Amnon, exercising his princely authority, after all, he is the heir apparent, orders everybody else out of the room. Leave us alone. That doesn't sound good either, does it? So everybody leaves. They have to obey the prince's words. And that's when trouble begins. He makes inappropriate suggestions. He takes inappropriate actions. Ultimately, he rapes her. A condition in the Bible that we don't really like to talk about, but it's there. And the amazing thing about all of this is when it's all over, the Bible says he hated her as much as he had ever loved her. That says don't trust emotions. Whatever it is I get emotional about, I'd better pull in, curb that, check it, look at it again. If he could move from extreme love, which you and I both know is lust, to extreme hate, something was wrong with him and what he was looking for. But think about poor Tamar. You know, we read the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife when she made similar efforts with him. Come lie with me. What an opening. And Joseph fled. Tamar didn't have that privilege. She was in the man's bedroom. He was the prince. He was her half-brother. She does say to him, and it took a great deal of courage, I'm sure, to do this, we don't do this kind of thing in Israel. This is not typical of our people. This is not typical of who we are. You know better than this. You can imagine all the sentences that are synonymous with what she's saying. We don't do this thing in Israel. But Amnon did. And so the act is done. The deed is done. David knows about it, but just doesn't somehow find the right way to say the right words. He needs to talk to Amnon about that. It's a little late to talk about it. He should have done something, but he didn't. And time passes. 2 years pass. 2 years when Tamar is defiled, when she's convinced no man will ever have her. She doesn't have a future now as wife and mother. She's been defiled. 2 years for Amnon to hate her even more. His hatred is so intense that he does the very thing that would happen in contemporary society. He decides it was all her fault. If she just hadn't come to my room and thrown herself at me. And all of a sudden he vindicates his own actions. She has to be at fault. She should be blamed. And so we move from the beginning of our text where we talk about Amnon and Tamar. They're the major characters in this. You have to know what the conflict was. The conflict began in the mind of Amnon and extended to physical mistreatment. And Tamar is left to wear the defilement for the remainder of her life. There's a third character who's involved in all of this, and that's Absalom, who is Tamar's full brother. Imagine how he felt when the word gets out that Amnon raped your sister. Now we know from the rest of the story of Absalom that he's a man of action. He's a man of strong emotions, and he's got to do something about it. But for 2 years, he wonders. 2 years he waits for the right time, the right circumstances, the right action. He plots for 2 years. How do I avenge my sister? How do I get revenge on my half-brother? And as the story unfolds, it comes a time of the year with sheep shearing. It's a time of great celebration among people who are shepherds. It's a time when everybody comes together and works together. The centerpiece of it all is supposedly sheep shearing. It's the time to remove the wool from the sheep. But tangentially, it's a time of celebration. You know, we can't do something big without having food. Somebody said they're convinced that somewhere in the Bible there's that verse that says, where 2 or 3 are gathered together, we have to eat. And so these folks have to eat. Sheep shearing means celebrate. Food. Everybody's going to gather, whether they're involved in the sheep shearing or not. They don't want to miss the party. And so Absalom suggests to David that he ought to attend too. And David thinks that's too much. After all, if the king comes, he brings all of his retinue. Now, it's one thing to prepare food for your family, as big as this family is. But for the idea of the king moving in, you may remember, all of us who got caught up in Downton Abbey, that the second movie based on Downton Abbey was when the king and queen decided to come to Downton Abbey to spend a few days. Now, the history of England is replete with those occasions when the king decides to go visit in some great mansion or castle, and he takes all of his court with him. And so the poor host and hostess are stuck with all of these royal guests who have to be treated royally and fed royally and put up royally, and they're exhausted and bankrupt by the time they leave. David kind of thinks this, and that's to his credit. This would be too much for you if I came. And so the decision is instead, would you let Amnon come? He's the crown prince. He's the heir apparent. It's almost like having the king. Let Amnon come. Well, the final decision is just let all the sons come. Now, I just pause here to make a mention of the fact that after all my checking, best thing I come up with is that David had about 21 sons. We don't know all of them, and we don't know what happened to a lot of them. We kind of focus on about 4 or 5 sons, and they deal with most of our emphasis. But if everybody came, all the sons came, that's enough trouble. Absalom just wants to be sure Amnon is there. It's the right time. It'll be the right set of circumstances. We'll find somehow to deal with him. So they come to the big celebration. Absalom sends word to some of his servants, just get Amnon drunk. Just get Amnon drunk. And when he's good and drunk, kill him. Surely by now it's already occurred to you, and our lesson pointed this out, that what we have in the story of Amnon and Tamar and Absalom is kind of Act 2 of the story of David and Bathsheba and Uriah. One commentator calls this section a chip off the old block. Like father, like son. Here is Amnon doing exactly what David had done. And you think of all the things that are so similar. It begins with lust. David saw Bathsheba and he lusted after her. It continues with sin, with adultery. Then it continues with deception. You remember how David insisted that he would get Uriah drunk, and he would go home and engage in sexual relations with Bathsheba, and then it would be obvious this baby she's carrying would have to be his. And the problem was Uriah wouldn't go home and get drunk. He stayed with his soldier friends. And now here is Absalom saying, be sure you get Amnon drunk. If you can cut down any sense of control or sense of what's right, you lower the defenses, almost anything can happen. And as in the case of Uriah, so with the case of Amnon, murder. The story is told over and over and over. Kill Amnon. I doubt that made Tamar feel any better. I'm sure she didn't say, well, I'm glad that's over. She couldn't move on anyway. Nobody would have her. But the deed has been done. The story continues then with Absalom realizing he's gone a little too far. Whether the father will say anything good or bad about him, he's not going to take a chance. And so he leaves home. He goes to his grandfather's house, Ptolemy, who is the king of Geshur. Absalom, you might notice, comes from royal blood on both sides. His father is a king in Israel. His grandfather is a king in Geshur. No wonder Absalom was a little proud and arrogant. He had royal blood from all sides of his veins. And so he runs off to his grandfather's house. And he stays there 3 years. Isn't it interesting that activities here don't occur overnight? Absalom waited 2 years to get revenge on Amnon. And now he waits 3 years to decide whether he's going to face David. When we go back to the murder of Amnon, you never can trust getting the news right, can you? The word gets out immediately that all of David's sons have been killed. And surely David wondered, why wasn't I there to protect them? But there's good old Jonadab. Jonadab says, no, all your sons were not killed, just Amnon. You still have all the others. It's just one. He minimizes it. Just one is gone. Just Amnon. There is nothing in the Bible that says anything at all about David responding to the death of Amnon the way he responded to the death of that infant. Jim pointed out last week David's words, he can't come to me, but I can go to him. Nothing is said about David's feeling toward the future with Amnon. He's just dead. And we move on. Interestingly enough, by the time we get to the end of this text, David is in deep mourning. But he's mourning for Absalom. He's not mourning for the child murdered. He's mourning for the murderer. This whole business about parents having favorite children, oh, there's a real danger there. We all know it. And it's clearly evident in the life of David. He favored Absalom, and he grieves for him. Unfortunately, in our study, we're going to look at the next 2 or 3 lessons involving David and Absalom. But I wanted to point out something that I thought was particularly useful and significant as I was preparing this lesson. John Willis, many of you remember when John used to teach at Lipscomb and then went on to Abilene. John wrote a commentary on 1 and 2 Samuel. And in his commentary on those 2 books, when he gets to the discussion of 2 Samuel 13, the text for today, John lists what he calls 6 important religious truths, things that we ought to learn from these incidents that matter to us in a religious sense. Number 1, uncontrolled lust will destroy a man. And there are sufficient examples in the Bible of uncontrolled lust. In the story of Joseph and his dealings, the story of Samson, the story here of David's sons, numerous opportunities. So much so that in the New Testament, John will remind us that the lust of the world can be dangerous. Lust, uncontrolled lust, destroys a man. Number 2, an evil friend is not concerned for what's best for his friend. Whatever the advice is that Jonadab has to offer does not necessarily mean it's going to be best for Amnon. Amnon gets killed out of all of this. And Jonadab goes on his way saying, well, just Amnon was dead. You got all the rest of your sons. Number 3, God's people live by a holy standard, a higher standard than what worldly people live by. Amen. There is a difference in human conduct, and it ought to be evident. If David lives by the standard of holiness, he didn't teach his sons. God's people live by a higher standard than worldly people. Number 4, simple sentence: sin is folly. Sin is folly. Go back to that first one about lust for a minute. You can lust for something, and then you finally wonder, what am I going to do if I get it? You can be so determined that something is out there that I have to have no matter what. When I was growing up, I had a favorite dog. Most boys do. My dog was rather well behaved, but I watched a lot of dogs who just loved to chase a car. And I always wondered, what are you going to do if you catch it? What are you going to do with that car? That's kind of the way lust does. What are you going to do if you get it? In the case of Amnon, it turned into hatred. Sin is folly. It's foolishness. Number 5, David's sins are repeated in his sons. That story of David and Bathsheba and Uriah is played over and over and over. It's like watching the same story on TV again and again. And finally, and I like this one from John Willis, he says, sin is a heart problem. Sin is a heart problem. Shirley and I are in the midst of reading the book of Exodus right now in our daily Bible readings. And a few days ago, as we were reading along, I ran across this statement in Exodus 34 when God said that he would visit the iniquity of the fathers upon the children and the children's children to the 3rd and 4th generations. I don't know any better example of that than the house of David. Nathan had said to him, the sword will not depart from your house. And it didn't. So far in our brief study of David and Solomon, David's already lost 2 sons. The sword has not departed. And he'll lose another and another. These things are just going to haunt him for a long, long time. To the 3rd and 4th generations. If I could piggyback on something Jim said last week, he has told us before that one of his favorite biblical characters is Peter, because we all feel an affinity with Peter. We see his strengths, but we also identify with his weaknesses. But then Jim said last week, he kind of put David in that same company. We want to identify with David's good points, but we clearly recognized that we can identify with his bad points. And he had some bad points. He had some weaknesses. Weaknesses that he had to struggle to get over. If he'd been able to control them a little better, he wouldn't have had to write the 51st Psalm. But he didn't. But we do identify with David, and we know what it's like to see your own life break apart. You do things you thought you would never do, but he did. And you watch your children fall apart, and you see them do things you thought surely they would never do. I taught them better than that. But they do. Somehow we have to learn to live with the world we have and the lives we have and recognize that we are taught a better standard. And the best thing for us to focus on is learning how to live by those standards that God has given us. Now I've summarized the text. I want to go back and read exactly what we had in the quarterly for today. From 2 Samuel chapter 13, and we'll pick up at verse 23. And it came to pass after 2 full years that Absalom had sheep shearers in Baal Hazor, which is near Ephraim. So Absalom invited all the king's sons. Then Absalom came to the king and said, "Kindly note, your servant has sheep shearers. Please let the king and his servants go with your servant." But the king said to Absalom, "No, my son, let us not all go now, lest we be a burden to you." Then he urged him, but he would not go, and he blessed him. David would not go, and he blessed Absalom. Then Absalom said, "If not, please let my brother Amnon go with us." And the king said to him, "Why should he go with you?" But Absalom urged him. So he let Amnon and all the king's sons go with him. Now Absalom had commanded his servants, saying, "Watch now. When Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I say to you, strike Amnon, then kill him. Do not be afraid. Have I not commanded you? Be courageous and valiant." I must pause to comment there. It's interesting that Absalom asserts his royal right. Have I not commanded you? I'm the king's son. I can make sure nothing happens to you. You just do what I tell you to do. So the servants of Absalom did to Amnon as Absalom had commanded. Then all the king's sons arose, and each one got on his mule and fled. That broke up this party in a big way. All the sons immediately knew they were in danger, and they fled. And it came to pass, while they were on the way, that news came to David, saying, "Absalom has killed all the king's sons, and not one of them is left." So the king arose and tore his garments and lay on the ground, and all his servants stood by with their clothes torn. That's the picture we got last week of David lying on the ground with his clothes torn as he pled for the life of that infant son that Bathsheba had borne. Then Jonadab, the son of Shimea, David's brother, answered and said, "Let not my lord suppose they've killed all the young men, the king's sons, for only Amnon is dead. For by the command of Absalom, this has been determined from the day that he forced his sister Tamar. Now therefore, let not my lord the king take the thing to his heart, to think that all the king's sons are dead, for only Amnon is dead." Notice the repetition. Be sure you get this. Only Amnon is dead. Don't worry about the others. Then Absalom fled. And the young man who was keeping watch lifted his eyes and looked, and there many people were coming from the road on the hillside behind him. And Jonadab said to the king, "Look, the king's sons are coming, just as your servant said. So it is." And so it was. As soon as he had finished speaking, that the king's sons indeed came, and they lifted up their voice and wept. Also the king and all his sons wept very bitterly. But Absalom fled and went to Talmai, the son of Amminahud, king of Geshur. And David mourned for his son every day. That has to be Absalom, not Amnon. So Absalom fled and went to Geshur and was there 3 years. And King David longed to go to Absalom, for he'd been comforted concerning Amnon, because he was dead. There was comfort with our Amnon. He was dead. You couldn't do anything about it. But Absalom, oh, how he grieved. He longed to go to Absalom. Seems to me that in the matter of things and the rights of the affair and so forth, Absalom should be the one wanting to go to David. But David wants to go to Absalom. Well, as I said, it's almost like a soap opera, certainly like a Greek tragedy, and it defiles the statement, happy families are all alike. Thanks for being in our class today. Oh, if you haven't had a new book, Jim and Doug have some books. Anybody need a book? Doug can't give them away. Thank you very much.